All right, so getting into chapter 12. In chapter 12, we're going to deal with it's called ANOVA. And what ANOVA stands for is analysis of variance. So we're going to have an introduction to what an ANOVA is in this chapter. And in this chapter, it specifically talks about a between subjects ANOVA, which we'll get into a little bit later. And so as you probably have noticed in class, each of these analyses essentially build off of each other. So the t-test, if you remember, is only limited to comparing two different groups or conditions or time points. So when we were talking about t-tests in the past 3 chapters, we talked about the fact that t-tests can be used to compare two different means to each other. But that's limiting in that sometimes you do want to compare more than just two groups to each other. So that would be a situation in which you would use an ANOVA, because an ANOVA can compare two or more groups or conditions. So technically, if you do have two groups, you can use either a t-test or an ANOVA. But the ANOVA adds a bit more in that, you can use an ANOVA analysis when you have more than two groups. So with that being said, let's talk about some of the other things related to ANOVA. So a lot of this should be review, but I just wanted to remind y'all of some of the things that we learned about, because we haven't talked about some of the stuff since chapter 1. So also one side note that I wanted to mention is you'll probably notice that I have underlined and bolded some of the words in the lecture. Those are the fill in the blanks on the lecture notes, just to make it a little bit easier. So let's recap some of these things that we learned about in chapter 1 related to research methods and research designs. So if you remember in chapter 1, we talked about the concept of the independent variables. So remember that in an experiment, the independent variable is that variable that the researcher is manipulating. So again, manipulation means that the researcher themselves are changing that variable. And the researcher changes that variable in at least one way, but an example in which, in talking about what an independent variable actually is, so let's say a researcher is randomly assigning participants to be in a certain temperature of room. So the researcher randomly assigns people to be in either a cold room, an average temperature room, or a hot room. So again, the key to the independent variable is that this is something that the researcher themselves is changing. So the conditions are those different possibilities that participants were assigned to. So the treatment conditions in this example would be the cold versus average versus hot temperature room. So again, the key here is the random assignment and the researcher manipulation. And the independent variable is different from a quasi-independent variable. So remember that a quasi-independent variable is something that's kind of treated as if it were an independent variable, but the key to quasi-independent variables is it actually was not manipulated by the researcher at all. So it's something that the researcher has measured, but the researcher didn't actually tell people what different conditions to be in. So an example of this might be if a researcher wanted to compare students who are psychology majors to biology majors to business majors. So again, here in this example, we have students who are already in one of those majors. So the researcher did not manipulate that variable in that the students were already in those majors. So the researcher did not tell the students which major to be in. So again, the key here is the lack of manipulation. The researcher didn't choose which group people were in. They were already existing groups. So the whole reason we're talking about independent variables and quasi-independent variables is that in the actual analysis of the statistics that we're going to use, so this also applies to t-tests, but especially in ANOVA, the analysis isn't different depending on whether it's an independent variable or a quasi-independent variable. However, you as a researcher need to know the different conclusions you can reach based on if it's an independent variable or a quasi-independent variable. So in general, in ANOVA, like I mentioned in the last slide, independent variables and quasi-independent variables are handled in the same way in the actual analysis. And so these are called factors. So the factor it could be either an independent variable or a quasi-independent variable. So really what a factor does is it just tells you what that either independent variable or quasi-independent variable, what that is. So a factor can be either an independent or quasi-independent variable, and it's the variable that the variable that says what group people are in. Another new term that we're learning about in this chapter is the term levels. So a level is just the individual groups, conditions, or time points that make up the factor. So you can think about it in that the factor is composed of levels. So it might be easier to think about these two different terms, thinking in terms of the previous examples. So in the first example I gave on the last slide, I told you about a researcher who was manipulating the room temperature that participants were in. So in that example, the factor is room temperature. That's the variable that was being manipulated in that case, the variable in which the people were in these different conditions. So the different conditions are called the levels. So the levels in that example would be you were either in the cold room, average room, or the hot room. So again, the factor in that example is the temperature of the room, and that factor is composed of those three different levels, cold, average, and hot. In the second example, the factor would be major. So whatever major you're in, so you're either in one of those three levels, psychology, biology, or business. So like I mentioned earlier, the actual analysis handles factors in the same way. The major thing that you need to remember is, as a researcher, you need to know when you can make conclusions about causality. So remember that we can only say that our variable causes some kind of outcome when it's a true independent variable. So when we actually, as a researcher, have manipulated that variable, that's the only time that we can say that it has a cause-effect relationship. So while these two different types of independent and quasi-independent variables, while they're handled the same in the actual analyses, we do have to keep in mind of what kind of conclusions we can reach for each of them.